And we're live. Okay, we are on episode 37. Joe is back to talk to us once again. And like I put in the show notes, we're going to be talking about Australian geckos. And we literally, right before hitting the live button, we're just saying that last time we kind of had a pretty varied conversation that didn't really get into the nitty gritty of geckos all that much, which I find very enjoyable. And then I got a lot of really cool comments on that and a lot of comments that asked a whole bunch of very specific gecko questions. And so we brought Joe back and we're going to try and get more into that side of things. So cool. The funny part about that is like, this is the second time I've had a guest come back and a lot of my conversations are trending that way of, man, you guys talked about all kinds of stuff. Like that dude was super cool. Like, well, I wish I would have asked him this one super specific question and I didn't think about it, or I didn't get to the live chat, or whatever the case may be. And then I have folks message me, oh, hey, you got to get him back and ask him this, ultra specific thing. And it's like, well, the whole idea is that folks would hear these episodes, realize that these folks are approachable, or like everybody I've interviewed has been cool. Like they're all nice people. It's been really nice conversations. And then I hope that listeners will take that as, yeah, man, just go ask them. Like it's cool. You see them at NARBC, like sitting at a table or what have you. Like,
oh yeah, and I can be messaged on Facebook or Instagram. If anybody has a question, I'm usually pretty good about getting back to people in 24 hours. If it's the middle of the busy season, my messages tend to go. So if I miss anybody, just message me the next day, and I apologize for that. And I'll definitely get you your info. You don't have to buy from me. I don't care who you are. I want your animal to do well and you to be happy with it. So if you have a question and it's geckos, let me know.
I always think that's funny where like, because I have it with the podcast a little bit and I have it with our business where we do animal shows quite a bit, where people, especially with social media and just internet in general, the whole instant gratification thing, and companies, of course, are incredibly responsive because they have a staff of like social media or PR or what have you.
Yeah.
And people get really used to that. Like Amazon just answers me, and it's one of those like, well, Joe's Geckos is Joe. Like, and Joe has to sleep sometimes, and that kind of thing.
I just drink more Red Bull.
Yeah. So, and it's just one of those where people like we've had quite a few conversations with folks where on our end, like planning shows or whatever, and it's like, oh well, X, Y, and Z, and I got back to them the next day or whatever, and they're like, oh, they're never really like rude about it, but it somehow gets mentioned, in the conversation of like, oh, I thought I'd hear from you or what have you. And I'm like, well, I was in Indiana and Teresa was in Wisconsin, and there's literally only two people. And they're oh, like, so you do the shows? And I'm like, yeah. Like there's only one bald dude with a beard on all the pictures and then one lady with weird hair. Like that's it. What?
You can get backlogged fast because like the priority is the animals. You have to take care of them. And like in the winter, it's super easy. Like I'll actually have a phone conversation or a message conversation with people in the winter. Because the amount of stuff I have to do when things are in cool, it's like maybe 15, 20 hours a week.
Right.
In the middle of summer, I have things being laid. I have the collections doubled in size at that point because all of the offspring, that I'm getting ready to be able to be big enough to know that it's okay to sell. Plus the normal collection in nest boxes, et cetera. And, sometimes that can get up to like 55, 60 hours a week. And that's only about a 2.5 month period of the year. But I'm very slow to get back to people during that time, unfortunately. But the upside is, when you get a gecko from somebody that's an individual hobbyist, whether if it's a hobby or a business, you're getting the information from that person. So there's no miscommunication. And you're getting an animal that was bred by that person. Now, I'm not saying that big companies can't do things right. There certainly are some that do it really well. But you're also getting an animal that's bred by a kid that's making $8 to $10 an hour that's learning as they go. Not to
Right.
say they can't do it, not to say they can't put out a perfectly healthy animal, but there's a difference. And I don't charge a premium. I charge whatever I see the normal retail is.
Right.
I'm not one of those people that puts my ego with my name and go, oh, my animals are worth more than yours. It's like when people offer me a trade and they try and say, well, I'll give you, $200 worth of geckos for $150 worth of yours. I'm like, no, you won't. And I wouldn't offer that to you. It's your stuff has a value, my stuff has a value, and it's whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah. But Aussie
So
geckos, one of my
yes.
favorite topics. I'm glad you picked that one. My favorite two groupings are Aussies and South African,
Okay.
because both of them have a huge diversity and more habitats than most people would assume. Like, a lot of, and this is, everybody was a beginner. I thought this at once, Australia's a desert, and it's going to be hot and dry, but the animals in hot and dry areas, they're really seeking out moisture areas like by clumps
Hmm.
of plants, cooler areas where dew might form in the morning. Transversely, if you go north or east or you go south, you have rainforests, you have some deciduous forests. There's mountains with colder temperatures where you have an extreme like um, towards the southeast, Phylloris platurus, which is an Australian leaftail.
Hmm.
They've been seen out eating in 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Now,
Yep.
for a reptile, that's incredible. Um, but you go, to the middle of the desert in Australia, and it can get up to 120 degrees. And those geckos aren't necessarily sitting out in it, but they're feeling that heat.
Right.
You take one species from one area, it's so varied what you can get there. Like Uidura, the velvet geckos, for example, they're one of those that's so broad brush. You can find them in tropical areas, arid areas, semi-high elevations, low elevations, and they've just speciated so well that they're in a lot of isolated areas, but they've managed to cover a big area of Australia. Um,
For sure.
but last
Mike.
time I was all over the place because I was very caffeinated, as I am right now. So I made a little note here for myself to kind of stay on track. So I think what we're going to do, if it's cool, we're going to cover
I'm good, man.
just the general Australian geckos. We're not going to go into all of them because there's 180 species, obviously. We're going to go more towards
Hey, man, we got
what,
till dawn. It's cool. Don't worry.
giddy
No,
up, 180
I'm just kidding.
species. Uh, but we'll start off with I think it's probably one of the most popular ones, and they're neck and neck with me between Neferus and the Aussie leaftails. I like them both a lot. But we're going to start with Neferus. They cover a very large part of Australia. Um, Up in the northern part, you can get species like Neferus asper, which are more of the darker, almost melanistic form with purple eyes. And then you come down and you've got kind of a rusty red form of asper, and there's also a banded form of asper. So that's an example of a species that's really, and one of those may actually become a new species before long, the banded one. But a species that's really developed into different habitats,
Hmm.
yet it's the same species, which is such, in my opinion, an important thing to pay attention to in herpetoculture, because that one, the habitat it came from because it's visibly distinct. But you have a lot of species out there, especially in Southeast Asia, where this one species has developed in different habitats, to some extent in parts of Madagascar as well, but they look exactly the same. So
Right.
you get like an order of cat geckos in for like an importer, and you have like 100 animals. Most of those are probably from the same area, but you never know. You might get an oddball. Hey, this guy's buddy up in this island region was offered some money to get some too, so you may get some mixed in. So something I do on the rare occasion that I'll get something like Sturdidactylus eloc or like cat geckos
Hmm.
is I'll find somebody that's
Pseudodactylus are super cool.
Oh my gosh, 170 species and climbing.
Yeah.
So crazy cool. But I like to visibly inspect like a large group, not
Okay.
only to pick out the nicest ones, but to look for physical characteristics that may be different. Not that there couldn't be DNA differences, but sometimes you can find big differences in those groups, and it can be the difference between animals being able to breed or not breed sometimes.
Okay.
The majority of my collection now is no longer wild caught animals in it. I think I have some eloc because I absolutely love those, and I do have some cat geckos. Obviously, no wild Australians because cutoff on that was in the 70s,
Right.
which we're heading towards some interesting times on that. I'm sure you probably saw on Facebook the majority of those species that are commercial are about to go CITES.
Yep.
So it means you can't have them in the US. You can breed them, you can ship them interstate, but you'll
Mhm.
no longer be able to without approved paperwork, which I'm assuming they aren't going to approve too easily. You won't be able to get them to Canada or to Japan or China or Europe.
Right.
Um, so I think right now is a really important time for people to start trying to outcross and get different bloodlines as much as possible if you can.
Yeah.
Um, because breeding brother to sister to mother to sister to brother to, I mean, well, you couldn't do that, but you know what I'm saying? At
Right.
least if you're getting animals from other people, it's spreading that gene pool out a little bit more. Um, I think it gets to a point with some species where if it's inbred to a point where it naturally is getting health issues, it's time to stop. It's okay to let that species go if we can't get new bloodlines. It's better than producing animals that are going to be damaged
Right.
off the bat. But it's also very species dependent because if you take something like Heteronocha, which is parthenogenic, I've had them for 14 or 15 years and they're annual breeders.
Hmm.
So how many generations am I in? With a parthenogenic species, it's just going to produce fertile eggs all on its own. And I'm not seeing any differences. There's no mutations. There's no problems. They act like the first generation that I had. So they're good. So now that I've sidetracked myself, back to
Well,
Neferus.
no, no, no. But on that though, I think that's one of those things where because, or my logic on that end, I guess, is that
Mhm.
because that's their method of reproduction, deleterious mutations would be quick. And so those generations before they ever even got here
Mhm.
likely would not have made it. And then the groupings that did get here, whatever bad we had would be weeded out very rapidly because of their method of reproduction being parthenogenic. Whereas you can kind of mask weak stuff. And
Mhm.
that makes me think those things I translate back to snakes much more than I do lizards because of their methods of feeding are different. And when folks do that, of we have bunches and bunches of snakes that they're problem feeders or they're hard to get feeding or what have you, and then we develop techniques to help use a pinky leg or maybe just a pinky head and do all these
Mhm.
different things, and then that never gets better. There are certain groups of snakes that as you breed them, it's like, dude, they
Oh
all
yeah,
suck. They all suck.
termite
None
feeding
of them
geckos
eat.
too.
You know. But
Yeah.
then you see something like Western hognose
Mhm.
and Eastern and Southern hognose, they suck. Only eat toads. They're beautiful. No one keeps them because we got to feed toads. Sucks. Western hognose, they'll come out of the egg with their face out of the egg and put a pinky in the egg. Like we only bred the ones that ate pinkies. All the rest of them suck and they
So
never
we
got
did that
bred.
out.
And so
Yeah.
we very rapidly got rid of that. Whereas when you're talking about something that's parthenogenic, you get what you get. Like we can't get a beast mode dad to cover up this kind of weak mom who's pretty sweet looking and then
Sure.
hope that the babies are sweet looking and at least close to beast mode dad. Like
Yep.
you don't get that. Like everybody looks like
Yeah.
mom and you just deal with it. you know.
Yep. Yeah. But the Neferus I was going into, um, we covered Asper. I'm going to break those down into, most people call them either like smooth skin or rough skin, which you have like your Amy eye and your Wheeler eye, which are, you can feel it and it's more of a bumpy, tough kind of skin. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
you have like a Levis or a Delaney or a Levisimus, and it feels very smooth and soft when you touch it. And I'm going to sling my own one in there, which is kind of an intermediate. Vertebralis, when you touch it, the skin feels kind of rough. It's not smooth like a Levisimus or a Levis, but it's definitely not like tough and spiky like a Amy eye or a Wheeler eye. And I noticed with them also, their eggs are a little bit tougher as far as being able to last in a nest box, kind of like an Amy eye would be, as opposed to Levis eggs, which are a little thinner and you kind of need to get to really fast.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, the a lot of people will say with the smooth ones for the husbandry, keep the sand moist or use a nest box. I like the nest box method. And with the rough ones, you really only have to spray the sand down and it can dry out in between. I've found
Okay.
with like, let's say Amy eye, for example, if they get a stuck on shed, I'm really good at getting stuck on sheds off. It is a giant pain in the butt because of those raised tubercles that they have with the little soft spikes on them. It
Oh,
just sticks to them.
okay.
So it's just my personal preference. If somebody lives on a coast where it's more humid, you may not need to. But here I use a nest box with my rough knob tails as well. Because in the fall and the winter, our air gets crazy dry here.
Right.
And that way they always have that option. And also a note, what I'll do with a lot of my nest boxes, if I have a moist nest box in something with like say 2 or 3 inches of dry sand, I'll take one box and sink it in the sand, and then I'll take the next box, the same exact type, put a hole in that and make sure one correlates in the other one, and I'll set it in the other one. That way you don't have to
Oh,
dig things out and mess with it. It just makes it quicker and easier
okay.
to just use that as a sleeve. Um, but I've found that the rough ones and the smooth skin ones actually use the nest boxes evenly, you know? Another husbandry thing I do for them, and really for anything terrestrial I have, is I make sure that if it's a single housed animal, I always have a hide, because most of them are, of course, nocturnal, on the warm
Mm-hmm.
spot and the cool side. If there's multiple animals, I'll have a few hides on the warm area and a few hides on the cooler area. That way, if
Okay.
they don't care if they're together, they're fine. If it's an animal that's feeling a little stressed or for some reason wants to be separated, they have the option. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty big on visual barriers, whether if it's a Neferus or like an arboreal Uidura, whatever species it is, because there's unseen stress. You know, when you have animals housed in the same enclosure that don't necessarily do that in the wild. Because in the
Sure.
wild,
Sure.
both of my arms are out. That's their enclosure. You know,
Yeah.
in captivity, it's bigger than this, you know, but it's a cage size thing. So I
Right.
like to make sure they have the options of being able to get away from each other. In the majority of my terrestrial geckos, um, I actually house singly, and after there's a clutch laid, I rotate the male in. Now, with a lot of those, you
Oh,
can
okay.
keep them together year round, and they'll be okay. But I've found that females tend to exhibit more natural behavior, carry a little bit better body weight, and seem a little less stressed if they're only exposed to that male for like 2 or 3 days every like month or so.
Okay.
Takes more space, takes more caging, but I honestly think it works better. So that's why I do it. Now, the only two exceptions I'll throw on that, because they're found gregariously in the wild in groups, is Heteronocha and viper geckos, which are, of course, not Australian, but you can keep them in groups with multiple hides and they do just fine.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so that's pretty much Neferus and a little bit of husbandry that's applicable to them. Stropharis are one I like a lot too. Um, Stropharis are those for the people listening that don't aren't familiar with them. They're those spiky-tailed thin ones. Most people in herpetoculture are familiar with chameleon geckos, Urodactyloides, and
Mhm.
that's about 900 miles east in New Caledonia from Australia, and they have sympatric behavior because they'll both sit out on a branch, kind of hugged to it during the day,
Mhm.
so they're getting UV even though they're a nocturnal species for both. Um, and they both also have different types of apparatuses in their tails, but they also exude and can squirt something that's irritating for like eyes and to a lesser extent skin. I've been squirted by them a couple of times, and I've only been squirted in the eye once. It
Oh, wow.
wasn't like excruciating, but it was definitely irritating. If it was a predator trying to eat an animal, it's a shock of enough because it doesn't have the result of glue, but it feels like gelatinous and kind of stuck to your eye, even though you can wipe it out. It's of course not going to dry to it.
Wow.
Um, so I mean, it's you know they thwarted me. They got me away. You
Right.
know, so
It was
it's one of
effective.
those things. It probably works pretty well for them. But yeah, they're an interesting species. Some key points I'd sling on Stropherus. Um, use finely barked, uh, you know, uh, branches for them.
Okay.
I like oak with like a really fine grain kind of bark, not like the big chunky kind of species. Birch works pretty good. Elm's okay. Just want to stay away from things like pine or things that are, anybody in the pet trade knows that kind
Right.
of puts off phenols and it's kind of gross. Um, I always like to use different thicknesses of branches for them because I think it helps the development in their hands, like the ligaments and the musculature. Because to just grab a monotypic width thing is not what they'd be doing in the wild.
Okay.
And when like if you're climbing something, you're using different grips and different hand things, and that's basically their locomotion.
Sure.
Um, Final key point on Stropherus. There's some species that it's recommended for UV. I think they're one of those that it's mandatory because I know in a few
Okay.
people's collections, the first year they have them, they'll produce great. The second year they have them, they'll produce okay. The third year they produce them, by their raising up things, they're not doing so good. And a lot of times the offspring actually don't breed well, second to third generation with no UV. I like Arcadia. Second to that, if I can't get it, Zoomed. And the reason why I like those is A, they put off a little bit of heat. Um, B, with the UV meter, you can read how far down they're going. For the size tanks I'm using, they're perfect.
Right.
Longevity is really good too. Um, the 12 and 14% that I use for most of my arid stuff, uh, basically what I will do with the UV meter is in about 12 to 18 months, it will start to slow down and it will get to that 5 to 7% read. You
Hmm.
can rotate that out for your tropical stuff. So you're
Okay.
not buying extra bulbs and just get new desert bulbs.
Okay.
It's just important to use an actual meter to be able to do that. And
Right.
anybody that's got a sizable collection, it's a well worthy investment. I can get them for
Yep.
250 to $300.
100%.
Um, but I'm going to lump Diplodactylus and Lucasium in kind of the same. They were actually used to be all Diplodactylus and they were split. The
Hmm.
major visual thing that most people will see is the Diplodactylus have more of a fat tail. They're all kind of small, like 2 to 5 inch geckos. And Lucasium are more thin bodied and have more of a thinner tail. Um, I think for some of those, UV is actually beneficial. I've known people that have bred them in racks. I use 5 gallon tanks because these are pretty small species, and
Sure.
I'll do layers of cork so that they have that visual barrier. And then I'll do a nest box on the cool side. Uh, they seem to do pretty well with that. They're not really hard to breed. I usually use kind of a mild cool on them, but I'm going to go into cooling for in general in a little bit on that.
So in the chat, I do have a question of
Yeah.
Carphodactylus laevis. Do you
Mhm.
keep those?
I do not.
Okay.
No. I like them. I think they're cool. People are just starting to figure them out.
Mm-hmm.
In the price range that I'm willing to go for something that's new and figure it out, I would go like 2 to 4K for a pair. The current value that I had heard on Carphodactylus, which was about a year ago, and forgive me if I'm wrong for some people, because when there's not a lot of something, those prices can range a lot.
Right.
But I was offered 10K per pair,
Ugh.
and they can kind of just drop dead out of nowhere.
Right.
Once they've been figured out a little bit more, I'm sure that's going to change. I think it's from what I talked to from a friend that was actually there that does stuff with power. He said that it's much, much cooler than a lot of people would or be able to really keep functionally in captivity unless you were cooling a room.
Oh,
So I think they're probably just being kept too warm. But that's
okay.
a super cool species. They're very alien-like. They look like a cross between an Underwoodosaurus, an Aussie leaftail, and a knobtail. I mean, they're one of those weird jumbled up kind of
Yep.
things. And a really cool thing about them, when they autotomize, when they drop their tail, a lot of species, the tail's going to wiggle to kind of
Mm-hmm.
attract that predator they're trying to get away from. They actually have gas pockets in their tail that hiss as the tail is autotomized. So it also gives an audible
Whoa.
clue that this is something I can eat to help distract that predator. Now, when they regrow their tail, it doesn't do that again. Um,
Oh, okay.
and for knowledge sake, for a lot of people out there, with the geckos, which is the majority of them that can drop their tail, the original, what goes through it is bone, and there's a causal break where it can break
Mm-hmm.
off easily. When they regrow it, though, it's actually more of a cartilaginous rod. It's no longer bone.
Yep.
So that's your dorky for fun science factor. Um, but yeah, the Carfos are cool. They're really cool. Someday I might do them. Today, not that day, because I won't start a new project with a new species with anything less than 2.2,
Right.
preferably 3 or 4 pairs. And if I did it the way I want, I'd be dropping 30 to 40K
Right.
um, on that project. It's too high risk for me, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah. I
broke,
mean,
but I'm
and
not
that's
lit. So,
understandable. I
oh
understand.
yeah, yeah. But it's a good question. Um, But Aussie leaf tails, these are one I really like a lot. I've got 5 species of those, and actually 4 species of Madagascan. These are cooler temperature animals that come in isolated pockets. A lot of them are in mountainous ranges. Some of them are mid-lowland, like Caudianulatus, which is the only Aussie leaf tail that really doesn't have a leaf tail. Everything else about it looks like a Phylorus, but the tail is actually just straight and kind of thin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the Aussie leaf tails, cooler temperatures, really, really cool. I mean, they rival the Madagascan ones. Actually, I like some of the Saltuarius more than some of the Europlatus. So
Wow.
Aussie leaf tails, if people aren't familiar, if you're newer or intermediate, you might not want to spend the money on them because they're not cheap. And for anybody that wants to get into them, you are going to have to be able to cool them really, really, really well. Um, for most of my species, I have a hibernaculum. It's about a walking closet size room that I use in the winter in the basement, and it gets down in the low to mid 50s, which
Okay.
is just passable. For most of them, I use a wine cooler for my Phylorus platurus because I'll get those down in like the mid 40s, you
Wow.
know. And yeah, they like it really cool, and it's just not functional to make a whole closet size room,
Sure.
that
Sure.
cold for 1 or 2 species. But they're cool. They're cool. If they autotomize their tail, they have a very hard time breeding. So,
Okay.
be very careful. Anybody that has projects with them or is raising them up, they will regrow their tail. It won't look as cool. They'll be able to breed with that regrown tail, but once you drop it, you're hoping for sperm storage for the rest of the season and getting 2 or 3 more fertile clutches.
Right.
Most of them are not very prolific. Most are in the 3 clutches a season range. For some of them, I mean, you're going to get, 4 to 5. If you're cooling them right, you're going to get 4 to 5. From what
Okay.
I've heard from a lot of US hobbyists, they're getting about 2 to 3, with one exception. Phylloris amnicola breeds like a friggin' crested gecko. It's the only one I would recommend for somebody that's newer that wants to get into it and has already kept a few species of geckos.
Okay.
Yeah, like mid 70s, the room I've got him in sometimes gets up to 78, 79. But I was concerned the first year that I produced them. My female, because I mark every clutch I get on painter's tape on the enclosures.
Okay.
And I believe she laid 11 clutches in 1 year. And I pulled the male after the 5th clutch. She just kept going.
Wow.
She just kept machine gunning it. So I'm keeping them a little bit cooler than I was.
Okay.
And I gave her the entire next year off just
Okay.
because, she needed to replenish and get healthy. And she still laid 4 clutches in a cooler room with no male. There were 2 fertile eggs out of all
Wow.
those. And that's fine. I didn't expect any. I really didn't care. I figured next season she'll go again. But,
Sure.
yeah. But
So
those are cool.
now, when you're talking about animals like that are just producing like crazy, how are you dealing with that as far as the food and supplementation side of things to help account for that?
Sure.
What do you do on that end?
It depends on the individual species. Like, say if it's something like a crested gecko that's super tough, they're going to rebound fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little concerned about over supplementing them.
Okay.
And they already get calcium put in everything they have, an extra protein. Well, I'm not, caveat, I think they're getting the correct amount of protein. I don't think they're really getting extra protein, but I'm going to go into that one in a little bit. I don't know. I think it's one of those things where I am over caffeinated. I just zoned out. Sorry. What were we covering again? What was the exact question?
So when you have a species like that that's just knocking eggs out back to back,
Yeah.
how do you address that
Nutrition.
nutritionally?
Like a Europlatus, they lay thick calcified eggs and they're going to crash fast and they
Right.
need a quick recovery. So I work ahead of the game on that. Like when I used to breed Henkeli, they lay a good amount of clutches and they lose calcium super fast. So they aren't the kind of species that's really going to lick much out of a calcium dish, even though I would keep one in there and constantly be replacing it. So I would actually do OP or oral doses of a liquid calcium,
Oh,
solution. I would take the actual calcium I use plus water, stir it up, draw some out in a syringe with no needle, and just kind of roll it on the tip of their mouth till they opened it and give them a very small amount of that
okay.
after every clutch that they laid. Because Europlatus can be notorious for crashing. I
Right.
think an issue that a lot of people don't do with them, and it shortens the generations you get out of them, is it seems like a lot of people don't cool them for some reason. And they're another one of those animals that comes from such you know, a country that's basically the length of the eastern side of the United States, but like in
Mm-hmm.
this long oval with a mountain range down most of the middle. So you have
Mm-hmm.
almost every habitat. You have mountain, you have dry forest, you have tropical, you have desert, equatorial rainforests that are warm all the time. So the old school methodology on Europlatus was room temperature bugs. um, the newer school methodology of that is their exact habitats. Like Fimbriatus, they live on the eastern coast where all of these cold rains are coming in. So when I used to keep Fimbriatus, I would spray them with cooler water and not just the water that's in the room. And they would be more reactive to that.
Okay.
If you take a species like Fantasticus, which is not super high, but higher elevation in cooler forests, they obviously aren't going to tolerate a lot of warm temperatures. And once you get
Right.
them outside of their specific habitat, the babies can be extremely sensitive. Now, there's a lot of people very successfully doing them well, but those are usually people that have a good habitat in their home. For that, they're providing a perfect habitat in the cage. Because I know people in some regions of the country that is a group that have skill don't do as well versus people like in a cooler, more humid environment part of the country. Because like
Right.
my winters, we get down to 10-12% humidity. Some coastal regions, not all, but some, you're not going to drop below 40-50 year round. That's low.
Right.
And then you take something like one of my favorites, which is kind of odd to a lot of people because it's very plain looking, but Ebanawi, the smallest of the Euryplatus, and it's from a slightly warmer region, like Lineatus are from bamboo forests where it's warmer. They don't really reproduce well in cooler temperatures. Like so far this season on the Ebanawi, I've got 20 plus eggs, and I'm maybe 25% of the way into the season. So I'm gonna produce a ton of those because they're in the upper 70s day and they're in the low to mid 70s night. They have good UV, but not too strong, and they're in planted up cages. I also like those a lot for my customers because baby Ebanawi, once you get them a little bit bigger, as far as Euryplatus go, they're really tough. As long as you don't keep them too cool, they do just fine and you don't have shedding problems.
Okay.
But Aussie geckos. So
Right. Also, Eric is in the chat just spamming away that he can't get behind any genus that eats Ebenavia. That's his comment for the day.
Kind of, yeah, I could get that. Yeah, because they're cool. They're very cool. I get that.
But he also was kind enough to knock himself by saying his former naive self was the kind of person that said, I sure hope CBB Platysaurus are more chill. And he found out that was wrong. So.
Yeah, oh, okay. That is interesting. Yeah, he works with small groups of stuff, but I know who Eric is. He does really well with stuff. He's a cool guy. Yeah. Yeah, the Ebenavia are an interesting one because those just got a taxonomic split up. So I'm not really sure we know what we have in captivity right now, but we know the genus. We know they're neat. They're not going back in the wild. That's something I see a lot of people can take a little bit too seriously. If you're doing this, you're doing it because you enjoy it. But the hobby, to a lesser extent, isn't always a conservation effort. And I think people need to be honest about that because I worked in AZA accredited zoo, and that's not to say that all zoos are perfect, but the animals that we're producing in captivity are not going back in the wild.
Right.
Sometimes I have mixed feelings about if zoo ones should. In specific setups where they're isolated, I think you have some viable, good things going on. But if you take a room, and not all zoos do this, but if you take a room and put 10 species from 10 different parts of the world, even if they've been through quarantine, some things carry, almost every living thing carries viruses, bacteria, things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Needs to be able to survive. And cross-contamination, when you have that many species from different parts of the world, and then you breed that animal and put those offspring that were in that room out in the natural habitat, I think that's the micro picture to look at. And it's usually fine, but it's just something to be cognizant of. I'm a big fan of, if you're going to do a conservation thing, isolate it, in your building to a specific region. And if it's a big enough project, have a specific person working it, or have a person that has another section work it at the end of the day. So they aren't, or not the end of the day, the beginning of the day, sorry, opposite quarantine. procedures. That way they're dealing with that first and they haven't dealt with other animals.
Sure.
Of course, if something's sick in an area, you want to do that last of the day. But,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think that over answers his question.
No, you're
so,
good. He responded in all caps that he doesn't want to talk about it. So I think he's kind of heartbroken about the Evanavia taxonomic changes.
I know he is. Yeah. Yeah. That's taxonomist got to keep a job.
That's right.
Yeah. But like Uidura, the velvet geckos, we touched on those a little earlier. Some taxonomic changes. The Australian velvet geckos are no longer just Uidura. There's also Amylosia, which has 2 species in it, and one I work with that was formerly Uidura, Nebulifera robusta. That's now monotypic. It's the only one in its genus, and it's actually my favorite velvet gecko. I used to work with a lot of them, and it's the only one I hung on to because it, like how a lot of people will say, fires up, fires down. It can go from like an almost like bluish gray when it's cold, like darker, and then when it's hot or warmer, it can go to like a light purple with like black bars on it. So it's a pretty cool species, and it's also, you can see it looks kind of like a velvet gecko, but kind of not. So I kind of see physiologically why it might get moved. It's kind of like Phelsuma clemeri. It's a day gecko, but it doesn't really, it moves like this, you know? It doesn't really move like a day gecko. It looks similar to a day gecko, but there are anatomical differences you can see.
Right.
But that being said, the current trend in geckos is the DNA and not the physiological, differences between them, which has changed around a lot of things, and it's tending to trend towards elevating things and getting rid of subspecies. So like 3 subspecies of something might become 3 full species or get knocked down to 1 species. It's or 2 or any direction, but subspecies are starting to disappear. That's been happening for a while now. But yeah, it's on Uidura. Heteronocha. Oh yeah, the little parthos. I love those things. Because Heteronocha, they are a gecko, and they're about yay big. They're not very big. So if you're gonna get them and breed them, you need very small crickets for the babies, or other food sources. They'll pretty much eat anything. But they're interesting. I had a customer I was mentioning when we were talking before that he put together one of the coolest tanks I think I've ever seen. It was a 40-gallon breeder. So it's 3 feet long and it's about 18 inches deep. And these things live in gregarious groups in the wild, in rock piles and different habitats. It's mostly Central Australia. I'm sure Amy, I eat them. They're right there. But basically, these 2 groups, which each had a heat lamp on top of each rock pile, they formed 2 solid different groups, and they didn't damage each other. They weren't overly aggressive, but they were kind of like, you stay on your side, chirp, chirp, chirp. I'll stay on my side, chirp. Hey, get away from me, chirp. And they would actually defend those rock piles, and they were like super vocal. So down the road, I need to set that up.
Yes.
Because it's very rare to hear them vocalize when you keep them in groups of 3 to 4.
Okay.
But evidently, when you keep them like that, which is probably how they should be kept, they're pretty auditory. So they're cool. And they're also, for people that aren't familiar with them, they're parthenogenic. They're one of the 3 partho species I work with. They lay fertile eggs without a mate. So you keep those warm and well fed, and they machine gun eggs at you. They'll have several generations before you know it. Carphodactylus we covered. Last thing I'm going to cover, because there's about 180 species of Aussie geckos, so I'm not going to go into all of the small little ones because this would take hours and hours and hours just for that section. And most people are never going to even see a picture of most of those.
Right.
I've actively tried to see like specimen pictures of everything I can there. And I mean, there's still probably at least 30 species I've never seen, even as a specimen picture. So,
Right.
the pygopods, which are super, super cool. And there is a reason we don't see them in captivity. They're kind of like a legless lizard, but because of their anatomy, they're all put in geckos. They technically are geckos.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we don't see them is most of them are lizard specialists. The one that we did see, and you'll know it, I think it's Lialis or Liasis jacardi.
Yep.
They also occur in New Guinea.
Yep.
Um,
I have
and they're a
kept
lizard.
several of those.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Most of them are obligate lizard specialists. Some of them may
Absolutely.
be able to take other stuff. But yeah, they're just worthy of a mention because they're so unique. They're kind of like North American legless lizards,
Mm-hmm.
but there's about 12 species of them there. And one of the interesting things about them is their eggs, unlike other gecko eggs, they're not like what most people would construe as a soft egg, like a crested egg, versus a hard shell egg, like your Euryplatus egg. They're actually leathery eggs, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
a snake egg, which is an interesting evolutionary in between because this thing looks kind of like a snake, but it's a gecko, lays leathery eggs, eats other lizards, which I guess eats other lizards is apropos for anything from Australia.
Right.
But yeah, but they're cool. They're very cool. Um, so let's jump over about 900 miles east of Australia into New Caledonia. I'm going to briefly go over a couple of things on that because I think there's some things in herpetoculture that we're getting really right. And think there's some things we can really work on. A lot of people in the beginning of keeping them were stating that you can keep these geckos at room temperatures. And room temperature is a very subjective, temperature,
For
and
sure.
most people will tell you like low 70s. Now, they can survive in those temperatures because they're a very tough species. Not all, but most of New Caledonian geckos are pretty tough.
Mm-hmm.
Just because something can survive in it, I don't think is necessarily the best way to do it. Um, New Caledonia in their winters, you're hitting temps in the 50s, like low 50s.
Yeah.
In the summer, it can get up into the 90s. And you have that in between part where, of course, you are in the 70s. So, what I do is I have them in a room in my basement. Then in the winter, it does get in the 50s. And then spring hits, and I let it get into the 70s with oil heaters on thermostats. And then
Okay.
when we get to summer, I actually use either UV or I use actual incandescent bulbs because I hoarded them when they stopped making them for hot spots, and I've seen males and females on a regular basis actively choose to thermoregulate in a room that's in the mid and in the very middle of summer, high 70s, go under something that's in the high 80s to low 90s.
Wow.
Especially gargoyles, especially Trachycephalus, especially gravid female Leachianus, and Ceras, which are usually very secretive. I find with Ceras sonorum, if you put a bunch of cork tubes stacked and going in different directions, you actually see them out more and more active, and you'll see them bask. Um,
Okay.
but I think the same way a lot of other reptiles work is they thermoregulate, and some just happen to be tough enough to tolerate that. Like the crested geckos I got 20 years ago, I wish I took video of it because they would pinpoint, grab a cricket, bam, I mean, on it. A lot of the ones that I see now, which are called, and I'm not dogging people because if they came in after the fact and generations of people have told them to keep them at room temps, they just don't know better. But a lot of the ones I see now kind of flop towards the cricket,
Yep.
and they don't have the same behaviors that the wild ones do. Like if people want to get on my Instagram or Facebook page and look at my New Caledonian geckos and then look at like online pictures of wild ones or like the Henkel Seep book, which is a great book if people can find that Rhacodactylus book, because it has year-round temperatures, it has habitats, a lot of info people just don't know or have to go by. But the derpy thing, it's real, you know, and
Yeah.
it's the weaker you make an animal and more generations you breed it, the weaker and weaker and weaker it's going to get. So I think we could use some improvement in that department. As far as feeding goes, I think a lot of the powder diets that we have some good nutrition in them, but if you look at studies on fecal matter from like SSAR or that Henkel Seep book, um, most of what they're eating is lizards and invertebrates and seasonally eating fruits. So not every meal that I give mine is a meal replacement. I think there's good nutrition in it. I think it is a good part of their diet. As a matter of fact, I give it a couple of times a month to all of my tropical stuff, like my tokays, my white lines, anything that day geckos, anything that comes from a tropical area, on occasion is exposed to fruit like that. So it's
Sure.
probably a part of their diet. Um, but it's not the only thing that I feed my New Caledonian geckos. I'll also feed them hornworms, crickets, dubia, on occasion, not fresh pinks, but like almost fuzzies because they've started to ossify and have calcium. And I actually dredge them in calcium powder before I feed them off to them. And that's primarily only for the lychees and the trackies, like the live bearing ones.
Right.
But yeah, I'm a big proponent of giving them whole prey items because we have different dentition, but imagine going your whole life only consuming a milkshake. You know, your muscles in your jaw are going to atrophy some. They'll still work, but not like they should. You know, all those sugars aren't necessarily good for them either, because there's only like about 3 to 4 fruits, depending on where they're at, that are available seasonally, and they're
Right.
mostly lower sugar, higher fiber fruits like figs. When I can get fresh figs, when I find them at the store, I hoard them. And I'll put some in my freezer and I'll use some with it, and I'll actually put it in my blend. You know, I use mostly when I do the fruit mix, I like the Pangea fruit and insect, the fig one. I'll add some figs to it. I'll also add some crickets and a little bit of dubia, and I'll toss some extra calcium with no D3 just for kicks. And my stuff does good on it. You know, my stuff's fast. It's not thin. It's not super big. I like cheeseburgers, so sometimes I am. But you know, they're lean and they're quick. You know, they're pinpoint on their food. So I'd recommend people try and cycle them at least as a start. You know, I wouldn't go full ham and just take animals that have been, you know, that are 10 years old and just put a heat lamp on them and just cool them the first year. I would just go,
Right.
you know, the room temps, but give them a cool, and then maybe the next year add a mild warm spot.
Right.
But
Since you
I think
mentioned Dubia in the chat,
Mhm.
Supreme Gecko asks, how do you control Dubia from getting into enclosures and then growing into the full-grown Godzilla size Dubia when you're dealing with smaller
Fruit fly
geckos?
cups,
Fruit fly cups.
attached fruit fly cups inside of the enclosures. Pre-dust them, put a little extra calcium in the bottom of the cup, and just like wedge them between 2 pieces of cork or rock and cork or whatever you have in there, or find a way to attach it. Um,
Okay.
I usually don't have much of a problem with that. I tend to stay away from feeding dubia to like diurnal species because they tend to get ignored more. But
Right.
a feeding cup is a good way. If anybody wants to feed them to Europlatus, I highly recommend using a cup and then putting a soft sponge at the bottom of it, because they have very soft noses and they have a habit of, some species of Europlatus will dive bomb them. And depending on what
Oh,
your substrate is, they can damage their snout.
okay.
Um, it's healable, but it's obviously better to avoid.
Right.
uh, yeah, yeah. Another thing I do in some of my tropical enclosures, if I want to put extra calcium in with a cup, I will take a deli cup, cut a hole the size of the gecko in it, put a cup of calcium down, and then put that deli cup over it. So when I spray, it doesn't muck that calcium up automatically.
Okay.
Now, the humidity will muck it up quicker than if it's in a drier enclosure, but that
Sure.
just is what it is. It just means you have to replace it once in a while. And as long as it's clean and it hasn't been in there a long time, you don't think it has bacteria, they'll still lick it if it's moist in 2 or 3 days.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You
Very
know?
cool.
But yeah, I cycle my New Caledonians in a whole prey. I think whole prey is a great thing. If anybody's starting off with whole prey and you've tried it twice and think that they won't eat it, I'm going to refer you to my 8-year-old daughter, who sometimes eats things the first time and sometimes eats them on the 20th. Something you can do is skip the calcium, whatever powder diet you're feeding, shake your prey item up in that so it's coated in it. So
Yep.
at least for the olfactory senses, they start to recognize it as food and then eventually move over to calcium on it.
Yep.
But most of the time they'll go for it within about the 5th to 10th feed. So I would say be patient with it. If it's insects, you may want to do what we just discussed with the fruit fly cup so that they're contained and they'll eventually figure out what it is and they'll eventually eat it. I had one lychee that I got from somebody that was 12 years old, and it was so used to only having, the MRP type stuff
Mm-hmm.
that when I dusted a pinky and put it on some forceps and tried to feed it, it kept like licking it, but pressing its face in it. Like, how do I eat this? I'm trying.
I'm trying
And
to
it,
slurp up this animal. Yeah.
right. And I eventually kind of wedged the head in and it kind of figured it out.
Yeah.
And now it does take them. So it's just a matter of being more patient than the animal and being consistent. They eventually do,
Right.
especially if they have room to thermoregulate. They'll want more protein when they're doing that.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah. Last thing I'll probably throw down on the New Caledonian stuff, and we don't know where this is from. And I know you've heard of this before, but Hoplodactylus delcordi. If any of the listeners haven't, I would strongly urge you Google it. It's the largest specimen of a gecko ever found. There's iffy records on it. It's in a French museum, and this thing's bigger than a lychee. I mean, it's not like a meter long, but it's well over 2 feet. It's bigger than a GT. It's bigger than like a Yate or a Point Dimier. It's a really cool specimen. There's some recent scientific theories that it's actually not from New Zealand, where they were thinking it was from, and
Okay.
that it may not be a Hoplodactylus. There's some fingers starting to point towards New Caledonia. Maybe it's a poorly preserved GT lychee, because sometimes when you preserve things, depending on the methods you use, you can
Sure.
make them smaller or you can make them bigger. So
Okay.
it may be a Leachianus or an animal that's very similar to it that lives somewhere in New Caledonia. And it's not conclusive. It's theoretical right now, but if we find it, I'd be happy. That's
Right.
it'd be super, super cool. Yeah,
So for people who
but
are listening that haven't heard us discuss that before, the specimen that he's talking about, I don't know how better to describe it. You're talking about like a mangrove monitor that's a gecko. Like it's a big, big lizard
very,
specimen.
very close.
Um,
Yeah, I'll tell you what. When this is posted to the Lizard Brain Radio Facebook page, I'll gank a picture of it, the preserved
there you go.
specimen, and I'll put it down in the comments for people to see.
And
Um,
much like we just talked about with crested geckos, don't
mhm.
slurp up your own food. Google it, and don't just rely on his picture.
Yeah,
So you can
yeah,
do some research and find
sure.
out. Um, but
Oh, and
yeah,
read about it. Yeah, it's
yeah,
cool.
and
It's
I think
it's
it's awesome that even in this day and age, there still is there's a whole group of scientists who were like, yeah, man, not sure, giant lizard, trying to figure it out.
yeah, yeah,
Like you would think that we just know
yeah.
stuff by now, and
Well,
we
and when
don't.
you have a preserved lizard that was poorly preserved over 100 years ago,
Right.
that came in off of a ship, it's just shoved in the basement of some museum with tons of cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's you, and this is a little off topic, but on topic. You think about, because I'm a everything guy. I like extinct stuff. I like living stuff. You think about some of the things that's happened in the natural history, like on a micro level with an individual animal, or on a big level. Like, some people are familiar with something that's called the KT boundary. That's it's basically this type of ash and chemicals that are in a certain strata that covers almost the entire Earth. And it's from when this asteroid that was massive landed off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. And the interesting thing about it is it hit a sulfur bed. So it put plumes of sulfur up in the atmosphere, and our planet turns at 2,000 miles an hour. Some of that's stabilized from gravity, but it's still moving the higher it goes up. And it's basically what probably killed the dinosaurs, because below that layer of ash and other chemicals that's in that layer all around the world are dinosaurs. What's above that is no dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, as you can imagine, if that meteor would have hit 2 seconds earlier or 2 seconds later, it would have hit, it wouldn't have hit that sulfur bed. There could still be dinosaurs on the planet right now, which is what kept
Yep.
us mammals in check, because
Yep.
the mammals that were around then were all like shrew size and mouse size. And there were a few rudimentary start of primates, not quite primates yet, but they were also very little things, because you had to live in a tree or underground or something was going to eat you quick.
Yep.
Jurassic World next weekend. Anyway, uh, but husbandry. Some differences between commercial setups and individual hobbyists are nuts that fill their whole basement with geckos. In an environment where you have multiple people working, I think like taking more exact records and weights of animals is very, very important, because say if
Okay.
one person is out sick or leaves to work a different job or quits or whatever, the next person's going to know what's going on with those animals. With an
Sure.
individual collection like mine, I do it pretty simply. I don't see a point in weighing my animals, because I prefer to individually spray. I don't use a misting system. So it keeps my eyes on every single enclosure and every single row in all the rooms. Um, and that keeps me really focused in on those animals. So I know what each individual animal should look like and what each individual specimen does. So weighing them is superfluous. If you see a difference, then you do something
Right.
about it. But I keep track of, on painter's tape, 3 different colors of it, which represent 3 different things.
Okay.
When the last clutch was laid, because that tells me when the next clutch will probably be laid. If there's any kind of health issues, if I had to take an animal to a vet, that I actually do a specimen card on, and I attach it in a Ziploc bag to the cage.
Okay.
Like I had a lychee that prolapsed, it was about 11 years ago, and they fixed it, with a purse stitch, and then they eventually took that out. I gave him
Mm-hmm.
2 years off, and now he's, been doing well for a very long time. But if there's ever any kind of issue down the road, I know, hey, if it happened a year after that, 2 years after that, I've got records to keep track of. I've got a vet to communicate with, because
Right.
that specific problem isn't, I mean, that's a pretty physical issue that can get fixed easily. But say if you're in suspicion of an animal, was born without the ability to develop calcium properly. Because like people, if you have 1,000 people born in a hospital, some of them are going to come out with no health issues at all. A certain smaller number of them could have health problems, and it's important to keep
Sure.
an eye on that. If it's really bad and it's going to cause the animal pain and it's going to have a bad life, you may want to get rid of the animal. If it's just deformed, but it eats and it's perfectly healthy and it's not in pain, I've had several of them that I still have that I just kind of I wanted to give them a home, so they have a home. Um, but yeah, I think right now, if for anybody that doesn't have a good vet to go to, find one because you don't want to be scrambling for it because you're going to find pretty quickly that with reptile, most mammalian veterinarians are pretty good. It's pretty hard to find a bad one from what I know, which is limited because I'm not a vet, but from what I've seen, I've had good luck. Reptile vets can vary. You can have somebody that went to college and specialized in it and they're on it and they read the journals and they know what's up. You could have a typical scenario where it's somebody who's a mammal vet, but they've also done the research and they're good at it. And they know what they're doing and they can help you. You also have some people that bought a book and think that they can also do it. And there's a lot more to it than that. You give
Right.
ivermectin to a tortoise and it's dead.
Yeah.
Which is something you'd give to a lizard and it's normal and it's fine. Uh, but yeah, so I
So
think records are important.
a really good resource for the veterinarian thing you were just talking about is ARAV. It's
Huh.
ARAV, ARAV.org. It's the
Okay.
Association of Reptile and Amphibian Veterinarians. And
Oh,
so
that's cool.
veterinarians that choose to take continuing education classes and become a member of ARAV have listed themselves on that website and are
Yeah.
accessible to folks. You can search it by region of the country, you can search it by state, and you can find vets that choose to actually take continuing ed and continue that specialization for reptiles and amphibians.
That's awesome because it's not an uncommon question I get from people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great resource I can send them to. I had no idea that existed. That's cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
then so on my end, uh, Erica McVeigh, people know her through
Oh yeah.
VivTech now with the
Right.
UV lights. She was the vet tech representative for ARAV for a long time. And then Pia Bartolini of Cody and Pia, that folks know from the Reptile Preservation Institute. Uh,
Mhm.
as far as I know, Pia is the vet tech representative to ARAV now. And Pia and Erica basically just ditch that off on each other every so many years to be the rep. Um,
Cool.
but yeah, when you're talking about on the professional side, um, I mean, they're some of the best people in the country. So it's a really
That's
awesome
awesome.
resource for folks.
Yeah, that's really good to know. A lot of the vets I know that are good are in zoos, so
Yeah,
I can't
yeah,
really send people to them.
for sure.
Yeah, yeah, but that's good to know. That's really good to know. Um, Next thing I was going to cover is hydration in a collection, and some of them are the obvious things, that we all do, like potable stuff that's lapped up off of a side or from a water bowl, like from spraying basically. There's pretty much, in my mind, there's like four different types of hydration. There's that. There's for terrestrial species, the hydration in the substrate. There's certain tropical species that are terrestrial. You can't keep on dry substrate. It'll even though they have a tougher skin and they don't really sweat like a mammal, it does help them. Ambient for some of your more tropical Europlatus are some of the most important examples I can think of for an animal that really needs ambient humidity. And again, like I mentioned before, it doesn't mean that all Europlatus need it super humid or that they need it humid all the time. I think fluctuating humidity is what most animals encounter in the wild.
Sure.
So just moist all the time, I wouldn't do. Um, and one that a lot of people get and some people overlook is the hydration in the food, especially for arid animals, because for some arid animals that aren't in a coastal area, that's a lot of the hydration that they actually get. It's like crucial. So I do water crystals in my food. Um, I try and do a lot of foods for my invertebrates that have both nutrition and have pretty permeable cell walls. Like I'll do collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens. This is for my prey items like the crickets and dubia,
Mm-hmm.
sweet potatoes, carrots. And basically what I'll do is I'll like shred them or break them, and I'll shock them in like a bowl of ice cold water, so it soaks in all of that, all that hydration. I'll shake it off so it doesn't make like a cricket enclosure wet, and then I'll place those in there. And I feed my inverts on pretty much a daily basis,
Okay.
because you constantly want nutrition going in. Cucumber's another good one. Doesn't have a ton of nutrition, um, but it puts a lot of hydration in them.
Sure.
I'm a big fan. I started about a year and a half ago, because I have a group of star tortoises. I get the Missouri Tortoise Chow,
Hmm.
and I'll soak that, because when you read the nutritional information on the bag, it's a lot of what a prey item would actually eat in the wild.
Yep.
And a lot of times people want to feed their prey items what the lizard eats directly, but that's not what those prey items are eating when the lizards are eating them in the wild. Sometimes I
Yep.
think it doubles down too much. So I try and pay attention to what their food would eat. And those Missouri tortoise pellets, I soak them for the extra hydration again. And man, just tons of good nutrients, lots of fiber,
Yep.
things like that. It's pretty good. Um, let's see. The inverts that I use specifically with the Aussies, I use banded crickets. I like those a lot. They're tough. They grow much slower than regular crickets, which means you can order them every other week instead of every week, which also saves you a ton in shipping when you look at that cost throughout a year. They have slightly better nutrition. The only thing I will say is the regular, like Anchieta domestica, the like quote unquote normal cricket before banded crickets were around, they're a little softer, they're a little slower. So more sensitive species tend to seem to like them more. I had some species that just did not want to transition to the banded crickets. Like my cave geckos will eat them fine now, but it took me a lot of mixing regular ones with banded ones, to breaking legs off banded ones, to eventually get them to do that.
Wow.
To Nopus, the babies have a really hard time catching the banded crickets. Um, Neferus asper, which can be very shy babies, I specifically buy them the normal crickets until they're about 3 to 4 months old, and then I switch them over to the banded crickets, and they take them.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
but I also do dubia. I have a small dubia room. They've got great nutrition, and again, what you put in your animals is what you're feeding your animals. So big on that. Horned worms, they're expensive, but I think they're worth it. Super high calcium. A lot of stuff I have likes them. And if you have an animal that like has big heavy eggs and drops a lot of weight every time it lays a clutch, man, that puts the weight and the health back on them real fast.
Right.
I utilize the pinks for trackies and for leechies. The Aussie stuff, it obviously evolved without a lot of mammalian prey available.
Sure.
So I don't think it eats much, if any. So I tend to avoid that. I did try a long time ago with a few of my female amii. It's probably about 9, 10 years ago. And for some reason, and it could have just been isolated to me for some reason, I fed them pinks like every other week, and then mostly invertebrates. And for the rest of that season, in the first half of the next season, they didn't lay a single egg. I don't know if it was too much fatty
Wow.
deposits that their body was trying to balance out or what, but it just didn't work. So I'm hands off on those for Aussies.
Okay.
You know, when I feed my inverts off, especially crickets, when I order my deli cups and stuff, I get those tropical fish bags, and I cut them about in half, and I use those to put the calcium in with the inverts and shake them up,
Hmm.
because I find if you kind of pinch them closed a little bit, you can angle them, and it's pretty quick and easy once you get a rhythm to, okay, there's only one little gecko in here that's kind of sensitive. I can drop one cricket out of this bag pretty easily and controlled. I get to the next one, bam, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just a more controlled, easy way to do it if you have a lot of things you're feeding. I used to use like one of those shaker cups, and it's really hard to control. Sometimes you're sitting there trying to pull those extra crickets back out because you don't want to stress an animal out and dump too much,
Right.
but you also have to get the number you want. I found fish bags are a good medium for that. They're super cheap. If you don't have them, you can obviously just cut the top off of the Ziploc. Supplements. Strophaurus, this is really important for, and for a lot of them. If you're using UVB, and I really recommend it with the Strophs, go very light on the calcium with D3, or maybe not even any D3 at all, because they're producing it from that UV. That genus, I mean, I can't speak for the whole genus, but the 4 species I've worked for from them, they seem to utilize that really well. And I've known a few keepers that have tried using D3, like heavy D3, in conjunction with the UV, and it can activate a gonadotropin hormone, and you'll usually get one good solid season where they'll lay a ton of eggs, but it'll
Okay.
burn your female out, and it's not good for her, and sometimes they'll crash.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but the species that you're not putting UV light on, I definitely recommend calcium with D3. Because D is one of those things, whether if it's D3 or regular D, vitamins A, D, E, and K are all fat soluble.
Yep.
So it's not like vitamin C where your body takes what it wants and excretes the rest. It builds in your fat tissues. And it takes a lot to build to a toxic level. But if it's too much for an extended period of time, too much AD or K can cause pretty big problems. It can cause crashes.
Right.
When I did go over the UV earlier, but the one thing I did need to mention is when I do UV on an enclosure, I'll do it on one side of the enclosure, because the animal needs to be able to be exposed to it when it wants it, but it also needs to be able to get away from it.
Sure.
So I'll also have like angled cork or areas of the tank it can totally get away from it, and then areas that it can totally, access it. Because a lot of people put their lights on timers for like 12, 14 hours a day, but that strong sun isn't on 12, 14 hours a day.
Right.
So I typically put my warm bulbs on for the daylight cycle, and then I put my UV bulbs on for like 8 to 10 hours, depending on the species, on a separate set of timers. I looked at. I've got somebody I know that's an electrician, so when I did my rooms, he wired up everything in all of them. Said I was lucky. That turned out really good.
Very cool. So on the food nutrition subject, while you're doing this, you have a Dubia room. Can you
Yep.
explain that? What is your Dubia
Yep.
setup? What is that like?
Make sure this is for the listeners. Get very smooth plastic, Rubbermaid tubs to do this, because of course some of them are a little more rough, a little more porous kind of edge, and they can climb up those. It's basically egg carton in there, water crystals, all the produce I mentioned before, plus tortoise pellets, that I feed those. There's a space heater in the room, an oil space heater, one of those metal radiator looking ones on a
Okay.
thermostat. And you really want that to be like in the upper 80s for them. They like the room's warm,
Okay.
even low 90s is fine as long as they're staying hydrated. Something my buddy Chris mentioned to me a long time ago that he does is he rolls cardboard up and sticks like a stainless steel screw or nail through it to hold it up. So it basically looks like a Swiss roll of cardboard, and
Okay.
it gives you more surface area outside of the egg carton. And the babies and smaller ones like to wedge in there, and they just seem to colonize better and produce more when they don't
Huh.
feel as crowded. And of course, I feed them off, so they don't get overcrowded. But yeah, keep them warm, keep them really hydrated. For some reason, and I cannot explain it, but other people that breed them, especially on a commercial scale, say this. Oranges, for some reason, makes them breed noticeably more than if they're not getting them. And I'm not sure what the science is behind that,
Okay.
but I did notice when I started buying the big cheap bags of oranges from Aldi's for them, the production went up and the temps were the same, the humidity was the same, the rest of the diet was the same, and they're well hydrated. So it wasn't
Huh.
the fluid in it, but there seems to be something in oranges that makes them do that. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep. For heating on stuff, of course, ambient heat bulbs, heat pads, heat cord, and heat tape. The one thing I did want to touch on that, and some people do this, some people don't. In racks, I replace my heat tape like about every 3 to 4 years in either my whole thermostat or my thermostat probe, depending on the brand. As well, I also replace a lot of my extension cords about every 3 to 3.5 years, and I write the dates on all this stuff when I get them. Because if you have a lot of electricity running through a lot of things, it's a matter of time before you can end up having a fire. The older that stuff gets, the more of a hazard it is.
Yep.
And this is my choice of incubators. I like Hovabators a lot. I've owned commercial grade refrigerator ones. I've got a nice cabinet one. I've owned all different. I've had Kemps. Hovabators do the job every time, and if you put a reliable thermostat on them, they're fine. I don't trust the wafer in them long run, and I know that that's replaceable. But I take a Sharpie and write the date on my Hovabators when I start them up, and about every 4 to 5 years, I replace those as well, because when you're putting $2,000 to $10,000 worth of eggs in an incubator, and it's a $50 incubator, well, now they're up to almost 70. And you have that incubator fail, it's like,
Right.
what was I thinking? So I just automatically replace them, and I have a thermostat with a probe going in all of them, so I can just walk by and see the temps on all of them.
Right.
Another thing I do is I put min-max thermostats in all of my rooms. One about mid-level. I'm a little over 2 meters tall, so at about my face level, and another one about 2 feet off the ground. And by min-max, what I mean is the kind where you can press a button and it clears, but within a day it tells you the hottest that part got and the coolest that part got. So you can kind of keep track of your temperatures, higher and lower in your room, and kind of get a good feel for that, because different times a year can yield very different results. And I even have very controlled rooms. I mean, I've got rooms that are underground, so they're pretty stable, and I insulated the ceilings in the rooms. So
Wow.
they're at the temps I want them to be. But it's still good to see that, because if you have any equipment fail or you add a new rack that isn't really well insulated or covered, it can spike temps in rooms pretty quick.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
Last
wait,
thing I'll say
before
on
you jump for a second, Wally did ask, what is your method for sorting dubia?
I have heard people say that this method doesn't work, but it does for me. And it does for a lot of people that breed them on a commercial scale. If you take, how Home Depot buckets or Lowe's or whatever you like, they have that lip. So if you put one inside the other one, there's about 3 inches of space between the buckets when they're stacked inside of each other.
Okay.
So in the bottom bucket has no holes in it. The next bucket you put in has like 1/8 inch holes drilled in the bottom. The next bucket you put in has 1/4 inch. And then the next bucket you put in has the next size up. So basically what you do is you shake out the tub in that top bucket, and you have something like an orange or a very sweet fruit in the bottom collecting bucket. And they separate themselves out because they can't get through the smaller and smaller holes depending on the sizes. So by the next
Okay.
morning you go down there, they're separated out by the sizes from the holes in the different tubs.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It works for me. So Yeah, I've had one person tell me that for some reason it didn't work for them, and I'm not sure why. Because I got the advice from somebody that breeds like on a commercial scale, and works for them, works for me. So yeah,
That's cool.
yeah, I definitely recommend it. Um, let's see.
Wally
Cycling and
says
breeding
he also uses the bucket method. How about separating babies from frass?
from I'm sorry, from what?
Frass, from the frass in the bottom.
Well, if you're using a very small size hole in the bottom bucket, you should have only that size in the bottom bucket. If that's answering his question.
There's no second comment, so.
Oh, okay. Did you? Yeah. Last thing. Cycling, breeding, and incubation. The cycling I kind of touched on before. I basically have a hard cool and a soft cool. The hard cool would be species like Aussie leaf tails, Neferus, things like that. Um, and basically that room gets down into the 50s. I have a backup air conditioner that can get down to, I think the lowest temp on it's 58. But if it does start, you hit a warm day in the winter and it spikes, that'll kick in and it helps keep the room cold. Um, but the my cycling for the winter, and this is really going to be for new people if you're cycling anything, you basically want to not feed it for 2 weeks, keep it under the normal heat conditions so it can metabolize everything out of its body and hyperhydrate it so that it goes into cool already hydrated and ready to go through a rough time of not metabolizing anything. When you drop those temps, it can't metabolize anyway. But my hard cool, it's for about 10 to 12 weeks. And I take the light period down to 8 hours in that room. And I spray about twice a week. And it's very important on a hard cool to not get the substrate moist because that actually will kill some geckos and some other lizards if they're moist and cold. You want them to be pretty much dry and cold. I spray the sides of the plastic tub or the sides of the glass in the enclosure. And those animals, if they want to, they will lick and drink off of that, but it doesn't oversaturate the enclosure. And because cold plus moist plus sand or substrate equals mold, it's
Sure.
not a good environment. The light cool, I keep them at the same ambient temps. It's a shorter cool. It's about half the time, about 6 weeks. But the actual heat sources, like the bulbs or the pads, are turned off. And I'll spray them 2 to 3 times a week. The light cycle is about 10 hours a day. And with those, you should keep an eye on all of them. But the soft cool ones, you have to keep more of an eye on because they're still thermoregulating a little bit and they can lose too much weight. Most of the time they don't, but it varies between species. So just on a light cool, keep a real close eye
Okay.
on them. Incubating, I already mentioned hoverbators. A lot of my enclosures, I use nest boxes. There's some species that seem to just prefer the substrate. Like my Aussie leaf tails, they just seem to like to lay in the substrate. Sometimes they do it even when I use nest boxes. So I just forgo the nest boxes and I just pay attention and keep an eye where the eggs are. For like Europlatus and those, anything that's going to lay in the substrate, I'll put a pile of leaves on one side or a curved piece of cork, and they tend to like to lay under that. So they won't do it 100% of the time, but most of the time they do. So it makes it a lot easier to find their eggs.
Okay.
Last one on the eggs are gluers. Any like some of the day geckos that do flying geckos, etc.
Yep.
If it's something that you want to hatch in there and the parents won't eat them, then you're fine, because the same environment the parents should be in is the same environment that they should hatch in anyway.
Sure.
But if it's one where the parents are going to eat it, I'll take a little moist moss in a cup and I'll tape that over it. Or if it's on a piece of cork or bamboo, I can remove it and put it in a tub and just hatch it out in there. A good trick, if it's a tricky egg that you want to incubate in a specific way, is that peel off stuff you can use for car tinting, like for the windows.
Yeah.
You take out when they're just about to lay, take out the bamboo, take out the cork, and just have that on the sides. And after they glue the eggs to that stuff, you can just
Oh,
take a razor
just peel
blade
off.
and cut that stuff off. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like some hard-shelled species, when they lay the eggs coming out, they're soft, but then they harden. So if you're using glass tanks, sometimes with some specific species, it can harden to the tank. So you have to hope you can incubate it in there, because you're going to break it trying to remove it if it's a
Right.
hard shelled egg. But you can put saran wrap down and then put the substrate on top of that. And if they lay the egg, it won't harden to that. You can just cut that saran wrap, remove it, and incubate it. Yeah, but
That's cool.
last thing is incubation boxes, because there's certainly different types. Most of your soft shell eggs, which most people are familiar with, New Caledonian geckos, leopard geckos, fat tail species like that, you can use incubation clay. A lot of companies sell it pre-bagged. If you're going to go through a lot, just get online and look for it. It's called Turfus, and you can get a giant bag of it for about $25. The nice thing about it is you rinse it off because it's really dusty. It absorbs it. If it's losing humidity, it gets lighter, so you know to add water. If you're really cheap and you just want to reuse it, which some people do, $20 for a big bag, I throw it away and use fresh stuff. You can boil it to sterilize it and reuse it if you want. Um,
Oh, that's cool.
yeah, vermiculite and perlite. I like using a mixture of the two when I do that. It's pretty good for Neferus. And the last one, and this is really the only one that needs to be said, because these are very common questions for me on hard shelled eggs. If it's tropical, I'll use a moist substrate in the box, and I'll take
Okay.
2-ounce cups with a dry substrate and put the egg in the dry substrate in the moist box. That way it's got
Okay.
high ambient humidity. Um, if it's a desert species, I'll basically use dry like perlite in the whole thing. And then I'll take a 2-ounce cup of the incubation clay and put it in the middle moist. That way it has some ambient humidity, so the eggs will hatch, but it doesn't make the eggs rot. Because if you take most, not all, but most arid species of eggs that are hard shell and get them wet, they usually rot and won't hatch. So those ones kind of
Okay.
have to be dry. But yeah, it's a lot of info. So that I was trying to make
Whole
up for
idea,
last
man.
time. So we mostly just hung out, which was awesome. It was fun, but threw a lot of stuff in there. So if anybody has
Yeah.
any questions, obviously private message me,
Yeah.
Facebook, Instagram. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. I do have a privacy setting on my account, but I'll pretty much accept about anybody that's into reptiles. Um, so yeah.
So I did have 2 questions in the chat that were not Aussie necessarily things, so I
Yeah,
wanted to
what you
kind
got?
of save them. We had some folks that want to know if you keep or have kept coleonyx.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had 3 species of them. Currently, the only one I'm working on is elegans. So it's one that's south of the United States. It's a tropical one from Central America.
Okay. And then the yellow-headed geckos, the gonatodes, I think is what they are.
I gotta be honest, I have bred some Spherodactylus and gonatodes, but they just kind of don't do it for me. I mean, once you've bred a couple of them, they are cool, but they're so similar. I never really got into them that heavily. So yeah, if I knew the taxon name, I could say if I did, but off the common name with those, I don't know most of the common names, unfortunately.
So I had a question, kind of,
Mhm.
I guess, in that realm, I suppose. Um, when you like, how do you pick, man? Like, you have
Mhm.
kept or keep everything I've ever heard of, a bunch of stuff I've never heard of. Like,
Mhm.
it seems like everything.
Yeah.
And is it one of those things where you're kind of a trial and error guy? Like, these are cool, I know how to keep geckos, I'll try them out, and then no, they're not for me, or
Yeah.
how do you decide those things?
Um, man, it's
I mean, at
30
this
years of
phase, you
working
kind
with
of
reptiles.
know.
Um, I've always kept some geckos, but I didn't start specializing until about 16, 17 years ago. And
Okay.
that's really when it took over the majority of the collection. Um, it was really just as many species as I could up front, but you eventually hit that wall where you realize there's only so much that I want to take care of and that I can keep up with. Um, so basically, how I do it now is I have a certain number of species that I'll keep, and that's really predicated on the difficulty level of the species in the collection. It can be as low as 60 or as high as 80, but I really don't let it get past that. And I do this full time for the people that don't know that.
Right.
So that's why I have the time to focus on that. There's just so many cool ones, man. I mean, there's 120 genera, which for newer people, that's plural for genus. And there's almost 2,000 species of geckos. Now, they're of course not all available, but it's not possible to breed them all. So basically, if it's legal for me to get and I can breed it, I'm gonna get it. I've been offered some species from like New Zealand, but that's such a high profile thing that do you want to risk your whole collection over one or two species? All that work, all those years, there's so much other cool stuff you can work with. To me, it's not worth the risk. I'm not going to mess with that.
Right.
Um, but there's tons of cool stuff you can get. The variety now isn't nearly what it was. And I'm sure you remember, of course, from a long time ago, you'd see the price lists and it's like, here's my hand, up here going to the floor.
Right.
It's huge price lists with tons of different species. Now it's much, much more limited, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, the last, and this is one of the best shows in the country, the last March Tinley, I literally actively looked for a species I hadn't bred before of gecko, and I couldn't find it, which was a first for me. I know people I can contact that breed oddball stuff, so I can always still find something new, but I
Sure.
keep it I keep it limited. If I'm going to breed a new species, it means I have to let go of something to keep the collection in a controllable size. So in an
Right.
average year, I'll let go of 4 to 5 species and bring in 4 to 5 new species. So it keeps it fun and new, and I'm still doing, new
Okay.
challenges, new stuff. But then there's a core of species that I just like so much, I'll probably never let go of those species. I'll just keep trading out for new bloodlines or outcrossing or whatever I can do. So
Okay.
yeah.
And then in the chat we have Underwoodasaurus
Mhm.
and your thought on the Millie husbandy reclassification.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a controversial one right now, because there's, of course,
Not
a
to put you on the
morph.
spot.
Yeah, yeah, well, no, I'm pretty straightforward, so I'll run at that one, but, husbandry or not husbandry, husbandi in the taxonomy community, it's been disputed back and forth. Currently, I don't believe it's accepted scientifically.
Right.
If you took a millie and a husbandy next to each other, they're similar, but you can see the physical differences in them. I don't
Right.
know what the molecular differences are. I suspect it's one of those that's going to go back and forth. Um, but yeah, I believe there was a third species of Underwoodasaurus like 4 or 5 years ago that came out, which was a split off. Um, And then there's also Viticolus, which looks very much like an Underwoodosaurus, but it's kind of more grayish a little bit. And that one used to be an Underwoodosaurus, but it was split out into its own genus because
Right.
taxonomists got to keep a job again.
Well,
You
so
know.
my thing on that is, so Reptile Fight Club is a different podcast, and they had a huge discussion on this, and I ended up chiming in with them a little bit, talking about it. And
Mhm.
the way I look at those things is, like with those two, you can see the difference, right? And maybe on the genetic level, it's not enough of a differentiation for scientists currently in the field to say it's two different species.
Mhm.
And then we as hobbyists, we get kind of amped up about that. And we're like, no, that's dumb. You can see the difference. And
Oh
then
yeah.
that's where you get that kind of argument going back and forth. And what folks I think have to realize is that when you're talking about that separation of a species or coming back together, and in the case of subspecies going away sometimes, is that it's one part. Like you tested it right now, and right now they're
Yeah.
not genetically distinct enough to be considered two species. We
Yep.
can see the difference. There's some physiological things happening because where they're from, maybe there are some changes happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in a century from now, 500 years from now, yeah, there might be some genetic differences, but that's just not like, I think folks struggle to look at that from the macro of
Mhm.
the big picture of that of, well, no, these two look different, dummy. Why do you say they're the same lizard? And it's like, well, because if you're not standing where they're from to
Sure.
know that the river shifted, or there was a rock slide or whatever happened, to know, like, hey, this just happened. It just
Mhm.
happened in 1995 that this river shifted, and now these two things look different. Well, hey, man, it's not enough for genetic diversity yet. Give it some time. And people just get super cranked. Like, no, I can. That thing has a gray face. Like, how dumb are you? It has to be a different lizard, and
Oh
they just
yeah.
get very up in arms.
Well, in the DNA, it can be so wildly different from the physical animal. Like
Sure.
you take viper geckos, for example. Do those look like any hemidactylus you've ever seen? No. But I mean, they're in hemidactylus now. And like palmetto gecko, the two species of that, like, the webfoot rangii, doesn't look anything like a pachy. Well, for the most part, it does not look like a pachydaculus to me. The eyes look more like a stenodactylus. But the DNA places it with pachydaculus. That's where it
Right.
is. It just physically evolved differently really quickly, I guess, and compared to you know, the micro level on that,
Yeah,
you
man.
know.
Everybody's been to that family reunion. You have that weird cousin where you're like, there's no way that dude's related to me. Yeah,
Yep.
they are.
Oh
That's just
yeah.
how it is.
Oh yeah. He's got 2,000 lizards in his basement. Um, yeah. But
And then
yeah.
Wally asked, do you keep your elegans together year round or introduce male to female and then remove the male after a certain period of time? Coleonyx is what he's talking about.
Yeah, with elegans specifically, I think they do fine if you don't overcrowd them. If you give them like say a sweater box size enclosure with multiple hides on the cool side in between and on the warm side, with them I go with the tropical mix and I use a curved cork because you can kind of bury it down in that and it's not so heavy it's going to crush them. Um, but yeah, if you want to do a really large enclosure for them for the size of the animal, I think it would be fine.
Right.
I do know of people that keep them in smaller enclosures and they seem to do okay for them. My thing, because I'm looking for so many eggs, it's a daily Easter egg hunt. Um, a large enclosure for tic tac size eggs, which
Right.
most of the time are buried to the bottom and you can take it out and look at it and see it and but sometimes aren't, is a little bit more of a pain in the butt for me. So I
Right.
prefer the size that's a little bit bigger than a shoebox, and I'll keep the male and rotate him with the female and keep the record on the front of it. It makes it
Okay.
faster to find the eggs. I think in most circumstances, those animals really aren't stuck in the same place. They don't cohabitate. So I think it's less stress on the animals. There's some
Okay.
terrestrial animals like knobtails. Most of them most species, people keep together year round in pairs, sometimes even trios, and they do okay. I just think they do, just for me, slightly better when you keep them housed separately. They look a little bulkier. The male doesn't look like it's been trying to breed all the time. The female looks like she's relaxed, has better body weight, better stores. That's just my personal preference. With a lot of this stuff, of
Sure.
course, there's multiple ways to do it. I would never say somebody's doing it wrong for doing that way. If it's working for them, it's working. At the
Right.
end of the day, what's working is what counts. Um, but I tend to take a few more steps, sometimes than I probably even need to, just because I want to yield the best result that I can. Like most of my projects, I would prefer to start off with like 8 to 10 babies from multiple people and raise them up myself, to know they're raised well, they're ready to go. I know the history of all of these animals. I'm good.
Okay.
Now, there's some circumstances because I deal with a lot of rare species where it's just not possible, and I have to buy a pair or I have to buy an adult to keep a project going. But my
Right.
preference is, and as a hobbyist, to raise it because that's kind of part of the fun. For me
Sure.
to feel really comfortable giving somebody advice on something, I like to have had it to like F2 or F3, bred it to the second or third generation. That way I didn't just keep it successfully. I didn't just produce it successfully. I've successfully kept it going right for multiple generations because a lot of people see that I've bred something and they're like, "Oh, well that's good." But if it's a more sensitive species, more difficult to work with one, you really don't know if you're doing it right until that like second or fifth generation where you can see these animals are coming out as healthy as the adults, if not better.
Right.
Yeah.
So on the breeding um, aspect of things, I suppose,
Mhm.
when you have, of course, you have a huge diversity of species, but um, a lot of the things that or how to verbalize that, a lot of gecko species that I see you working with and post to Instagram and different things, um, phenotypically as a species, they're all pretty similar. And so, is that something where when you are working with a project and you have to pick a holdback, or I need a male, or what have you, um, are you really getting down into the nitty gritty? Like, this little line of dots is cool, and so I'm going for that, or are you?
Not as
I need a
much.
male for this upcoming year, and so I'm going to hold a male, or how do you make those decisions?
Um, I try and do trade outs really, because that way I'm keeping it as diverse as I possibly can.
Okay.
Um, it basically I'd rather trade 4 of my babies for 4 of somebody else's babies, so that I'm at least trying to diversify it. I think one of the things that we commonly see in herpetoculture is unrelated. And I'm going to put that in a big quotation mark
Especially
because
when we talk about Australian stuff.
bingo, bingo.
Yeah.
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 It's like, you don't, the vast majority of people don't know where those bloodlines came from. And a lot of them came through Europe
Right.
or came from Europe to the US to Europe to back to the US.
Yep.
Um, you really don't. Um, unless somebody specifically knows where those bloodlines came from, the first generation of animals coming in, or it was produced through their collection specifically, really don't know. I'll give you a good example. It's about 2.5 years ago. I wanted to add some more Clemeri to my group. Now, Phelsuma Clemeri, I want to say this is about 9 or 10, no, longer, 12 or 13 years ago, roughly, came in once. once over a decade ago. I had a guy on a classified page trying to tell me he had 5 different bloodlines of Clemeri. And this is an annual species, I mean, they're mature in a year. I'm like, man, where did you get the bloodlines from? And he's like, well, I got them from this person and this other person, and then I got this person. And I'm thinking to myself, did this guy really buy 10 different Clemeri from 10 different people to do that? Or maybe he did, but didn't realize that even if he did go through that, and even if he did do that, they all came from multiple sources, but over a decade ago. Nobody knows the bloodlines on those. It's impossible. But the flip side of that coin is you take a species like Pachydaktylus fasciatus, which came in over 20 years ago, is 2.1. 2 males, 1 female. They still breed strong, and they aren't even showing pattern breaking. So that's also an animal that's isolated to one small rock area. So they probably had to do that or they couldn't have survived.
Right.
Because in that part of Africa where it's hot and dry and there's lots of predators, if you go out, you're ate. So you kind of have to stay to where you're at. It seems like inbreeding rates are much higher in mammals and birds than you see in reptiles. And I'm not advocating for intentionally inbreeding things, but it is a part of the hobby that people need to be honest about. Anything that originally came from like Brazil or Mexico or Sri Lanka or India, or for the most part, New Caledonia, they don't issue a lot of permits, but they do issue some. Actually, there are some people in Europe that do legit research there that are allowed to bring some back. So there are some fresher bloodlines of that. But you know where I'm getting at with that. It just, if you can't explain where it came from the wild to the generation you have, and you only bought it from other people, you can't say that you have unrelated. You can say, I've done my best to get through different people that have less related animals. And in some cases, they may not be depending on the species, but in a lot of cases, they are. They're just very resilient.
Yeah, and that's a part of herpetoculture. The species that we have popularized and had a great deal of success with, it turns out that they don't struggle with those things. And the species that do struggle, the species that do struggle with those things either fade out of popularity in the hobby, they're no longer in the hobby, or they're incredibly niche, where you got to know a guy, he only really gets 5 or 6 babies a year and probably just gives them to his buddies. Those things are just incredibly rare, and it's because they don't do well in a commercialized bulk processing of being available to pets.
I have species of Pachydaktylus and Hemidactylus that people there's some that people want, but there's some that I personally like that people don't, and it's not uncommon for me to just give some to some of my friends because I know they're not going to sell well. People don't want to put a heat source on something that is plain to them but biologically interesting to me. So and I don't want to let it go, so I just intentionally produce very small numbers, and sometimes I'll even skip a year. And for people out there that do this on a larger hobby scale or a business, a good outlet is science teachers. I've got a group in Missouri and Illinois that, like, my animals, when they maybe have a year of breeding left or no breeding left, but that species is probably going to live another 3 to 5 years, I just give them full disclosure on it, and I'll just give it to them for free, because that's a way I don't have to take care of that animal forever, but I got a good breeding life out of it. Transversely, sometimes I like an animal too much, and I'll hold back like 8 to 10 pairs, and I'm like, man, I don't know if I can sell the production from 8 pairs of that. So then I'll sell off some of my own personal breeders. And that's not common, but it does happen.
Right. Well, and that's like that part of it is, the things that you keep for you that maybe aren't commercially successful or whatever. Um, when newer people in herpetoculture hear people like us kind of romanticize old school herpetoculture, um, they always think that like we're like making fun of ball python groups or whatever like the trendy thing
Mhm.
is to make fun of in herpetoculture
I
right
am.
then.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Mostly. But
um, but what we're actually reminiscing about or remembering, and it's not even reminiscence because it still happens, but um is that is like, you happen to be into X species, and most people
sure.
don't think it's that cool because it's like a tan gecko or whatever, but
Yep.
it's it's interesting for some obscure reason, and you think it's cool, and you got like four friends that are like, oh, that's pretty sweet, and they keep something random, and that's like when you're hanging out at NARBC and then you just see people like chilling out in the chairs off to the side and they're all holding deli cups, but like nobody's giving anybody money.
Yeah.
That's what's happening right there.
Oh
And
yeah.
like
Yeah.
when you're talking to new people and you know and they see the surface of it and like, oh, these are cool pets and I really want a chameleon, and so you get one and then you have a pet, and that's your jam and cool, and but they're not eyeballs deep in it like we are, to where
Sure.
you have a handful of nerd friends and you just kind of trade these weird lizards and snakes and oddball frogs together.
Yep.
That's the part that you hear, quote unquote, old timers, people with white in their beard, um
Yep.
that's what they're romanticizing, is like, yeah, we make money and breed things and it's a business and it's cool, but like this little side, like this is the cool part of like,
Yeah.
we're just chilling. This is really important to me. And
Yep.
these three people know it's important to me for this reason because it's on some weird leaf or whatever. And I made my three friends excited about that. And now we
Yeah.
just hang
Which
out and
is
talk
cool.
about that. You know?
Yeah. It's one of the things I really recommend to new people that tell me that they want to make a run at it as far as like being a business goes. One of the biggest pieces of advice I have is do not work with things you don't want to work with because
Hmm.
you think you're going to make money on it. Because you're going to get tired of it. You're going to get burnt out. And there's so many different things that you can work with. Like, I've had a few people in the New Caledonian crowd, which I have a lot of friends in. I'm not knocking that crowd, that are like, you have all this weird oddball stuff that doesn't sell. I'm like, hey, walk this room with me, that there's 200 vendors in. There are 40 tables in this room with the same 5 species of New Caledonian geckos. There are only so many people that come through that door that are
Right.
looking for it. So, I mean, if you're going to sell a good amount, you better have some real impressive animals or a big name, and preferably both. Because when you're new, you're still going to be able to sell some stuff, but you might have to discount more. You might have to wholesale some at the end of the season by the time you get the next year's hatching, or you may
Hmm.
just want to sit on them because, I mean, older sexable animals are worth a little bit more money.
Right.
Um, but there's guaranteed at a larger show, and I only vend the NARBCs now exclusively.
Right.
There's so many people that come through looking for cave geckos, so many people that want African Tinopus. Um, it I'm I've jumbled about 30 different species in my head right now because I have a lot of different things on my table: viper
Yeah.
geckos, web-footed geckos, chondrodactylus, etc.
Yeah.
I work with those New Caledonian geckos because I do like them. And they do sell for me, you know, but it's one of those markets where I think you have your big five basically. You have crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, um, Chihuahua, Leachianus, and Saracenorums, basically. And it seems like there's a certain amount of cresteds, especially now that there are some quote unquote forms or morphs, whatever angle somebody wants to say that. I've heard people argue about it. Um, that are going to sell steady no matter what. But it seems like one of those big five every year sells better than the rest.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
like for a few years, Chihuahua were going for crazy money, and now they're back down to what they were prior to that. For a while
Yep.
there, red striped gargoyles were going for crazy money, and unless you have a big name in it, they're going for more normal prices again. And it'll keep cycling like that. Like right now, I love Leachianis. I have 13 pairs, 11 of which are
Wow.
breeding. But when you walk through a show right now, you see a lot of lychees on a lot of tables.
True.
So I have people in Asia that, for the most part, I'll sell like 30 Leachianas to and ship them off in one box, and they're
Wow.
getting a discounted rate because they're paying, they're paying for 30 Leachianas, but their market value on those are also higher than our market values. So
Sure.
they're not paying 50% wholesale, which I wouldn't sell them at, but they're paying between wholesale and retail, which is still good money when you have 30 of something to sell. And, I like helping other hobbyists, but on something that's pretty easy to take care of, it's much easier to deal with one person than 30,
And then Greg asked, do you keep Pseudo Gecko smaragdinus?
I do not. I think that they're a very cool animal. The Philippines has a ban on export. Those showed up in the hobby 4 years ago, maybe 5. And that
Fair.
ban's been well over 20 years.
Yes, it has.
So it's people are going to do what they're going to do, and I'm not knocking other people. This is just my personal decision. Because I know that I'm not going to touch them. I'd like to, because they're a species I haven't worked with, and they are cool. And I hear they have really neat audible sounds. There's a thing on YouTube that I saw of it. No, it just
I get it.
It's cool, but I'm gonna pass on that one. Yeah.
Totally understand. Okay, well, we have cruised past 2 hours.
Cool.
So,
went quick.
Where can folks who didn't get enough about Australian geckos or the multitude of other things you keep come find you and pick your brain?
Sure. Primarily Facebook is the best place. And as long as we have at least some people in common and I see that they have reptiles on their page, because I do check before I accept friendships on friendships on Facebook. I'm not friends with 5,000 people, but it for the most part I accept about anybody, and you can send a message even if I'm not friends. It just pops up in my thing I have to approve to do.
Right.
Facebook is my preferred. I'm also on Instagram, and I do check that about once a day. So if people prefer Instagram, I'll get back to them on there. That's pretty much it. The main place that I post at is Fauna Classifieds, and that's nothing against other classified pages. There's a specific reason. I actually like Morph Market a lot, but with Fauna, I can post a list of things. And because I work with so many species, it's much easier for me to post 20 to 30 species in one list. And I
Okay.
get on Morph Market and I buy from people on Morph Market, but I don't want to be that guy that has to take pictures of every animal that I'm selling when some of them are monotypic. They all look the same.
Right.
And then I shove everybody else back in the gecko section, like 3 pages that just posted their ad. To me, that's kind of a rude thing to do to people. Now, eventually, I probably will start posting on Morph Market, but it will be like 2 to 4 ads at a time per section, just so it's like specific things that maybe a little higher end or a little rare that you don't see on there as often. But it's not going to cram everybody else back pages,
Right.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's also kind of crazy that you work with so many things that would push the gecko back pages.
Yeah. Well, I've seen people do that with other things where they only work with 1 or 2 species.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, I just took 45 minutes making this ad, and now it's on page 4 an hour and a half later because 30 leopard gecko ads from one person or 30 cresteds or whatever, any.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, man. I really appreciate you coming back for round 2. It was awesome.
For sure. For sure. Good stuff, man. Have a great one.
You too. Thank you. All right. That was episode 37. I'm so glad he said he would come back and talk to us. Like I said, I had a lot of folks that really loved the first conversation and the style of getting to know somebody and having that conversation in that way. And then I had a bunch of folks, as evidenced by the chat, for everybody that showed up. Thank you. And had lots of very specific questions, of course, because he has such a diverse collection and such a history of keeping all of these different things. Lots of people want to pick his brain. And so I'm glad so many of you came. It was really awesome. So I still have folks booked out for several months. We're continuing with lots of new people and new types of lizards to talk about. And I have a few more coming in for round 2, the way that Joe did, to talk to us about specific things in collections, or maybe some things we didn't get to in first go rounds, very similar to this style. So I think that should be really cool. And I am wearing my Asclepius Snakebite Foundation shirt. Snakes and Stogies on the Herpetoculture Network had a raffle to benefit the foundation, and fortunately for me, maybe unfortunately for folks that like to watch stuff on the network, I won 2 of those things in the raffle. That totally wasn't planned. I definitely paid my money and entered. You guys can go check and make sure I paid. But it was really cool. They have raised a lot of money for the foundation. It was a fun thing to participate in. Snakes and Stogies has done a bunch of raffles to benefit a number of charities. It's always a good time. They always have really cool stuff. And so I really appreciate everybody who donated for that. And thank you to everybody who entered and tried to win. There is still more stuff to be raffled off later. So make sure you're paying attention to the posts from the Herpetoculture Network and the various things they're raffling. It's always a good time. They raise money for really cool stuff, and you can usually win some pretty neat things. As always, we're sponsored by Black Box Cages. I am continuing to work on the set that I have. Justin, I believe, has posted or is maybe still working on editing a room tour for Jake and all the different things that he has for Black Box. So that should be pretty exciting. Like I said before, when I went to the show in Georgia and picked up a number of the things that I had, the guys were there, and I got to see some of the stuff that they were adding to their collection, different enclosures and racks. It's all really impressive. And I know Justin and Jake both have rooms as opposed to myself having a facility. And the way they set things up and laid things out to be more efficient, it's really cool. So I hope you guys get to see that and maybe get some ideas for it. So I will see you all again in 2 weeks. Later.